This morning I want to depart from what I almost always do, and that is I'm going to be talking in part autobiographically. I've made it a point of my leadership not to talk about myself. It's not about me. It's about the world. It's about ethics. But I'm going to take the liberty of being somewhat autobiographical and very personal this morning. You reach a certain age in life where you don't care anymore. I mean, there's a certain freedom with getting older. You let go of your ego. You can make a fool of yourself. You can be self-disclosing. It doesn't make so much difference. And so, with that sort of liberty under my belt, I'll share a few things that probably nobody here knows about me in terms of my background, which I'm, feel free to do. Well, let me just say one thing that sort of is the occasion. This September marked my 50th year since I began my professional career in ethical culture. As I've mentioned before, saying it's my 50th year doesn't sound quite as daunting as saying it's a half a century. I mean, that really does sound intimidating. But memory closes the gap of time, and it doesn't seem like that long. I can very well remember when I began and so forth. And 50 years doesn't seem like 50 years. But it was in 1969, at the age of 21, that I initiated my work as a leader in training at the New York Ethical Society. And I conclude that I was probably the youngest person in our 140-year-plus history of ethical culture to basically start professionally at that age, just 21. Well, since that time, I've lost count as to how many platform addresses I've actually given. It's probably somewhere between 500 and 600, or maybe more. And if truth be told, I think it quite extraordinary, and much to their credit, that in the early years of my career, people who were 2, 3, and even 4 times my age would actually come out to hear what this young punk had to say. I mean, it was really quite extraordinary when I look at it. And it's a testament, really, not to me, but I think to the openness of people who have been members of ethical culture throughout. Back then, as I mentioned, throughout my long tenure, I've always taken my commitment to the Sunday morning address very seriously. In the mind of our founder, Felix Adler, and in mine as well, it really is the central defining activity of ethical culture. It is the experience that expresses what we are, and it's the occasion from which our message goes forth. And it's the weekly event which helps to bind us more than anything else, bind us together as a community, which is so very important. Throughout the years, I've guided myself by a list of principles when thinking about what to say on Sunday mornings. First, I am committed, and this is very difficult after 600 or 700 talks, I am committed to trying to say something new and original with each address, and I have never given the same address twice at the same ethical society. And while I'm sure that I could dig through my archives and pull up a talk that I gave 30 years ago, and no one would know any difference, okay? You gotta trust me, folks, that my ethics and my conscience do not permit me to do that, okay? So each time I struggle with having to say something that is new, not that everything, in every address is absolutely original, but the topic and the way in which I go about it is new. My second principle is I don't believe in talking down to my audience. While the platform address should not be an academic lecture, and at its best should strive to inspire, I recall it the idea at giving talks which are simplistic, platitudinous, or simply dopey, or strive to uplift the emotions while being devoid of intellectual content. I personally do believe that ideas matter, and it is my bias that our addresses should give those who come here something to think about, and at their best discuss with others, with their families or whatever, over the dinner table. And when I do hear that that in fact does happen, I consider it a very high compliment when people actually take what we do here and extend it forward into their family life and so on and so forth. That's really among the highest compliments. And lastly, and this is my own personal proclivity, as noted, I steer clear of talking about myself. We are about ethics and ethical ideals, private ethics, social ethics, public ethics, and I am very conscious not to make my addresses self-centered. And certainly, I've never believed that the Ethical Society should be a fan club for its professional leader, okay? I'm just not that way. I just sort of dissipate my energy around. We're a democratic organization. I've always believed the society belongs to its members, not to me, and so on and so forth. And I've never tried to really, basically, in a certain sense, put myself up front in that sort of self-centered way. But I have to say that this, in a certain way, in a certain sense, this is overtly true. But at a deeper level, actually, the vast majority of my talks are really autobiographical in the sense that I use the occasion of creating the address to challenge myself with the purpose of working out intellectual or philosophical problems that I myself am struggling with, and that tension becomes a sort of stimulus for my creativity. In other words, I'm usually struggling with something. I use the address to try to work it out. So in that sense, at a much deeper level, there is a type of personal or autobiographical element, however intellectualized it might be. But now, with having been at this for a half a century, I feel the time has come to occasionally begin to look back, look at the larger picture, the swath of my career, and wander into some personal experiences that have informed my thinking, and that's what I want to do today. There are several streams in my life, biographical and intellectual, religious, that have made me an ethical culture leader and a humanist, and I want to talk about one of those streams, which was absolutely essential in my choosing ethical culture as a profession many years ago. Without this influence, I would not be here. I would have been doing something else. So it was not the only influence, but it was an absolutely essential one. This morning, in fact, what I want to do is talk about one specific thinker, more than any other, who is responsible for having molded and given direction to my values and my life, both personally and, as noted, professionally. In fact, it is absolutely, as noted, absolutely and completely true that this thinker was responsible for my becoming a leader in the ethical culture movement, which, needless to say, has not been an insignificant component of my life. The figure who had such a penetrating influence on my life was the American social psychologist Erich Fromm, who was born in 1900 and died in 1980. In fact, I was looking through, it was a total collection of his books, and I was looking through one of them, and I always clip out things and put them in books, and they fall out, you know, like decades later. I actually found a copy of, I read it again, it was sort of interesting, a copy, I have an obituary reader. I sort of habitually read obituaries, and I actually, you know, cut out his obituary when he died from the New York Times in 1980, and you can see it's sort of turning brown and so on, but it was, I found it in the leaves of one of his books that I had, and I thought it was interesting. That's Erich Fromm there, a picture. Died in Switzerland. So anyway, died in 1980. But Fromm, I should say, and here I get personal, would not have made such a significant impression on me if my early life experience had not been disposed to receiving his ideas and finding them attractive and relevant to where I was. It was at what, in effect, was a very critical time in my life. So I need to begin there, and this, again, involves my being actually very, 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 very personal. Fromm became very important to me because my adolescence was an extremely unhappy one. I was the older of two children, and my mom, who loved me dearly and whom I honor as a sincerely ethical person, she in many ways gave me my ethics, died when I was 12 years old. The cause of my mom's death when she was 47 was probably a cerebral hemorrhage that she suffered at home, in fact, right in front of me. She was taken to the hospital where she died after about 10 days, my having never seen her again after the ambulance took her away. Now, my father was always very remote. Born in 1903, he was 10 years older than my mother and spent his childhood in abject poverty in what you call a shtetl in the Ukraine, which is a small Jewish village in the Ukraine. Except for 3 years of Hebrew and religious training, my father had absolutely no formal education whatsoever, though in his wanderings he managed to pick up 7 languages, which was not that unusual for Europeans. And now I'm not sure he knew them all grammatically, but he actually could speak 7 languages. Okay. Characteristic of men also from that time and place, he spoke very, very, very little about his background. And I know almost nothing about his life before that time. He was a stranger to me. He did tell me once that he had witnessed, actually physically as a child, had witnessed pogroms, Tsarist pogroms in his village, and he had suffered from typhoid fever as a child. He must have traveled, and here I have to be speculative, traveled around Europe as a teenager, separated from his older siblings, and settled in Cuba in the early 1920s, probably, I would guess, after the doors of immigration to the United States were closed, which was in 1924. Probably wanted to come to the United States and couldn't, I'm just guessing, and therefore went to Cuba. He became, in Havana, a haberdasher. and a successful middle-class businessman in what were probably the best years of his life. You know, Cuba in those days was the Las Vegas of the East, you know, with gambling casinos and the good life for those people who attained. And was very poor, of course, if you were a rural Cuban and worked in the sugarcane fields. But he, in effect, was middle class, lived in the city. I saw, there were actually photographs of his very large haberdashery store on Neptuno Street in Havana, and was successful and was able to take advantage, I think, of the good life that Havana had to offer people in his class status. In 1946, he relocated to the United States, soon met the woman who would become my mother, quickly married, and I was born in 1948 when my father was 45 years old. So he was actually pretty old. He was 50 when my younger brother was born. So he was pretty old to be my dad. My father spoke with a thick accent, was very formal, always formally dressed. And my parents never wore dungarees or sat on the floor, you know. I mean, that was the 1960s and they changed. Always very formally dressed. He once said, Joseph, you will be judged by your hat, your tie, and your shoes. Well, I almost never wear a hat, although I have one today. I very seldom wear a tie, which for me actually is an act of rebellion, because I generally don't do it, and my shoes are never polished. So that was the lesson I got from my father. But as mentioned, he was very remote. I believe the person who was very self-absorbed and tragically had no sensitivity whatsoever for the needs and feelings of the child. I experienced him as a somewhat intimidating figure, especially compared to my mother's embracing warmth and love. Well, after my mother's death, my father proved to be totally and absolutely incapable of maintaining a viable household for me and my younger brother. He fell apart physically, mentally, and emotionally. Indeed, my dad became a tyrant who went into fits of rage, and because he was pathologically and extremely anxious about money, I guess it was part of his abject poverty in his background, and an expression of an increasing emotional illness. It was not beyond him to feign heart attacks if I asked him for 35 cents for lunch money for school, or claim that I was trying anytime I needed any money, a little bit of pocket change. He was basically accusing me of attempting to kill him, and so on and so forth. It was not his, he became mentally ill later, but it was a function, I think, of a fear of emotional illness, of being incapable, very isolated, and very lost after my mother's death. Well, this was a very tough environment for a withdrawn, defenseless, vulnerable 14-year-old to bear. Because I was the older, my father took out his rage on me primarily and demanded that I do all the housework, which as a child, because he wouldn't hire anybody to do it, was beyond my capabilities. In his later years, he became increasingly mentally incoherent and developed one of the earliest diagnosed cases of myasthenia gravis, which is a neuromuscular disorder that impaired his ability to see and to walk and left him very, very fearful. My greatest impulse was always to escape what was a miserable and frightening environment where I was felt incredibly alone, and I have to admit, at times very self-pitying. Which I did. I was able to escape through taking long solitary walks in my neighborhood in Queens. For the last 3 years of his life, my father was in a nursing home, relatively young to be in a nursing home, which created the unusual situation of 2 minor children living alone in an apartment without any adult supervision whatsoever, care, or needless to say, any love. I should say that finances were not a big problem because I was able to get, my brother and me were able to get Social Security, and I had an aunt, a mother's sister who was terrible, who administered it. I think she may have stolen some of it along the way, who administered the Social Security, and I was able, my father was so disabled at that point that when I would visit him, I was able to get him to write out a check for rent and so forth, because he sort of lost his capacity to hold on to his money. So it was a deteriorating situation, but my brother and I were able to financially, sustain ourselves in what was 2 kids living together for 3 years alone without any parental supervision. Very unusual sort of situation. Well, I was always a hypersensitive child, and this unusual situation emotionally took its toll on me. There were no alternative adult figures, absolutely none, that I could look to for nurturance, and through my adolescence I was extremely lonely and very depressed. It was a condition that lasted until my early 20s, and as with all children who've had a difficult start in life, I have to admit it's left its scars. I mean, it's something I've had to cope with all my life. I don't get depressed anymore. I mean, depression is not part of my emotional repertoire. I've long been able to get over that. But in those years, I was consumed by it. It was very difficult. Not to the point that I couldn't get out of bed in the morning, but it was always an emotion that weighed on you. It was very, very, very hard. Not surprisingly, I looked for anchorages to cling to pull myself out of my emotional condition. And because of my family background and my temperament, I focused my energy on schoolwork and developing my intellectual capacities, which included throwing myself into books as a mechanism of escape from the torrents of inner life. You know, if you emotionally can't control your life, I mean, if you're overwhelmed by emotions, I'm not the only one to respond this way. And it was very natural for me. I didn't have to think about it very much. What you do is you begin to focus your attention on one thing or a few things in order to basically push out, try to get beyond the negative emotions. And that's what I did. And because of my temperament and my background, I have an uncle who is a classics professor. I had other relatives who my mother was very unusual. My father had no education, but she actually was unusual. Born in 1913, she had a college education. She was a graduate of Hunter College, class of 1933, which was very unusual, and did absolutely nothing with her college education. I mean, that was also not uncommon. I mean, she raised her two children until she died in 1960. But anyway, what I did was develop a strategy to cope with my overwhelming emotional condition of trying to basically focus my whatever attention I could and my energies on one thing, and that was my intellectual capabilities. So if I look like and act and talk like an intellectual, it's probably because, you know, of those circumstances that molded me in that direction, and that was not a bad thing. And I spent a lot of time reading books, very big books. So there were things from Moby Dick to Ben-Hur. I love the movie. Whatever happened to Charlton Heston? I mean, Ben-Hur. I remember reading Moby Dick. I read all of John Steinbeck, Ernest Hemingway, and endless nonfiction. In college, which I started when I was only 16, I majored in Latin and Greek, which demanded a great deal of rigor and attention to vocabulary, to grammar, and to syntax. I remember sitting for hours trying to translate Greek dramas, Greek tragedies with a dictionary and having to look up every other word. I mean, it was very, very, very painstaking in a certain sense. But it was a way to give structure to my life. That was the important thing, and a way of shutting out the world. You know, I mean, that was sort of the emotional strategy. Anyway, it was around this time that I began reading psychology. Okay, I've gone through various intellectual phases. If you look at the books upstairs in the office, which are all mine, you'll see they're sort of roughly divided into sections, each one that reflects a different intellectual stage that I can sort of pass through. And one stage that I was into at that time was to read a lot of psychology, especially those psychologists who became identified with what became known in the 1960s as the humanistic psychology movement. People such as Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, Albert Ellis. And I felt the need to read a good deal of Freud as well, okay? It was through this interest, which was spurred by my personal needs, that I discovered the works of Erich Fromm, which provided for me a kind of emotional lifeline and a psychology that appealed to a sense of hope that I looked to leverage myself out of my feelings of deprivation and misery at the time. In short, the appeal of Fromm's thought was not merely for me intellectual, but very, as I'm implying, very personal, almost as a vehicle to personal salvation in a psychological sense. I simply found Erich Fromm's ideas immensely captivating, and I couldn't get enough of it. Within a short period of time, I devoured all of his popular writings. Fromm, although technically very capable, wrote primarily for the general public in a style that was extremely accessible and indeed very engaging. It was logically comprehensive and coherent while not being simplistic. While easy to grasp, I sensed that behind his writing was a theoretical intelligence and a type of creativity. Okay. Apparently, I was not the only person to whom Erich Fromm had great appeal. Fromm had taught at Columbia and had an appointment at Yale and other universities, but came to think that academia was just too narrow and that the problems of the day required that he address public audiences. According to a foreword in a recent biography by Lawrence Friedman, a Harvard scholar, he noted that, quote, Fromm directed his books towards a broad public, and the way they were received was nothing short of spectacular. The sales were not in the thousands, but in the millions. Indeed, only one of his books sold fewer than 1 million copies. The record was set by The Art of Loving, which since its publication more than half a century ago has sold more than 25 million copies and still sells well today. His emphasis on the importance of love, his hatred of war, his commitment to democratic socialist values, his searching critique of consumerism and materialism, and his overarching humanism have made him one of the most admired figures of the 20th century, end quote. For a kid who was lonely and miserable, Fromm's writings seemed to provide a way out. His philosophy responded to my loneliness with an image of loving social relations and the power and warmth of the human bond. More importantly, for an adolescent who was withdrawn and felt himself a victim of horrible circumstance, he demonstrated that one had the resources within oneself to mold one's life and to live a life that was fulfilling and productive. Fromm had written, quote, happiness is the indication that man has found the answers to the problem of human existence, the productive realization of his potentialities, and thus simultaneously being one with the world and preserving the integrity of the self, end quote. And as biographer again, Lawrence Friedman noted, quote, for Fromm, reduced to its essence, the productive life was rational, spontaneous, creative, and loving, if not exuberant. This end piece, end quote. The centerpiece of Fromm's philosophy was the living of a productive life. For Fromm, the very purpose of life, and this was the centerpiece of his philosophy, the very purpose, you ask, what is the purpose of life? And his response was the very purpose of life is simply to live life to the fullest, and I became determined to do so, okay? In other words, the full realization of one's powers and potentials is the end and purpose of living. And for me at that time, that idea just captivated me as being incredibly powerful. It was thoughts such as these that to a forlorn kid was simply music to my ears and filled me with hope. They also gave my life a sense of purpose and direction. In short, I became committed to getting beyond my condition by setting goals for myself in the service of living an energetic and full life, sometimes admittedly going to extremes. And so, for example, this is the 60s after all, and so, for example, when I was 21, I got into my car in Forest Hills, Queens, and drove 5,000 miles to Fairbanks, Alaska, just in effect to be able to cross the North American continent, camping all the way. I was able to fulfill a wanderlust. I mean, I've been across America by car, camping in almost every state, you know, 5 times, I think, and later, more recently, of course, I rode my bicycle across the United States. And not least, I decided to get 3 graduate degrees from the world's greatest, one of the world's greatest universities. That was a lot of hard work. It's like a hazing, a PhD is like a hazing, you know. So it's just a lot of hard work and a lot of grind. And not least, and this was very important to me, I married a wonderful woman who came loaded with 6 children, okay, all inspired by the humanistic project of living a full and active life. I dare say most 24-year-old men would flee from a woman with 6 children, okay? But beyond love and attraction, I embraced it as an opportunity to fulfill my humanistic capacities and potentials. I mean, what better opportunity to develop your capacity for love, caring, nurturance, and so on, to take on a family with 6 kids, right? I mean, that was part, it was in part, and I can't say raising my kids was exclusively a project, you know, a humanistic project, but that was part of it. It was part of my thinking. It was an opportunity rather than something that would be a burden, and so on. And that was part of the humanism that I was internalizing in great measure from having been influenced by the thought of Erich Fromm. But digging deeper, I feel a need to explain the basis of Fromm's social psychology. Erich Fromm saw himself as an exponent of the contributions to the thought of Sigmund Freud and Karl Marx. Fromm was a social thinker, but by profession a psychoanalyst, for whom Freud in the early and mid-20th century, of course, was the reigning authority. Though Fromm pays great homage to Freud, and he traveled in psychoanalytic circles, he is really more interested in using Freud as a foil to demonstrate his own thought and how it departs from Freud's and his own understanding of human nature that he believes improves upon the thinking of the master. Fromm also borrows from the thought of Karl Marx, not so much Karl Marx, the later Karl Marx, the Karl Marx of Capital, Karl Marx, the economist, but Marx is a social thinker whom Fromm interprets as a type of humanist. Indeed, he sees Marx as his intellectual hero, and it's my view, to be critical here, that his interpretation of Marx, although valuable in some aspects, is actually overstated. I think he gets some, he wrote a book on Marx, which is what you'd call technically a hagiography. That is, he sees him almost as a sacred figure whom he valorizes beyond, I think, the point that, where he moves and really veers into inaccuracy. But that's a small point. The launching point for Fromm's psychology is his departure from Freud. Freud's understanding of human behavior was tightly rooted in human biology, especially man's instinctual nature, especially his libidinal and sexual drives, as well as his aggression. In simplest terms, our characters are sublimated expressions of our instinctual and libidinal natures. It is Fromm's salient contribution, however, departing and critical of Freud, that our characters are not formed in reaction to our biological drives. And in this regard, Fromm introduced his governing concept, his central concept of what he calls, quote, social character. And what does that mean? First and foremost, human beings, he says, are social beings. We live our lives with others. We need others for our survival, and we form our own characters in our social relations with others. In short, according to Fromm, it is not our libidinal energy that shapes our individual personality, but our lives are shaped by the social structure and culture in which we live. As Fromm put it, quote, socially produced drives are specifically human and have to be explained as reactions toward a particular fit of social conditions and not as sublimations of instincts, end quote. By positing that our characters are formed by the nature of our social relations, Fromm by no means was suggesting that the human being is a tabula rasa, or a blank slate, who is passively molded by society and our social relations. Rather, he believed that, and this is sort of out of favor these days, but he believed that there is such a thing as human nature, that propels us forward, and in this regard, his philosophy of human nature rests on the thought, ultimately, of Aristotle and Spinoza, and his view of human nature is central to his thinking. It is also an idea that I must admit, captivated my attention, and still does. In Fromm's view, as with all living things, we have an innate propensity, as he puts it, to develop and unfold. By nature, it is in us to develop and unfold our latent potentialities. As living beings, we all have an inborn propensity to expand our powers in the service of becoming the kinds of people we become. We all have an organic drive to actualize or realize our potentials, just as an acorn has the natural propensity to become a mighty oak. In simplest terms for Fromm, fulfillment or happiness is equated with the successful unfolding or realization of our potentials. Contrawise, when our potentials are stunted or go unrealized or undeveloped, we find ourselves unhappy and unfulfilled. And the power lies within us and not outside of us to set our course on the successful realization of our potentials, our physical, intellectual, emotional, and sexual potentials. In his own words, quote, "To be alive is a dynamic and not a static concept. Existence and the unfolding of the specific powers of an organism are one and the same. The aims of a man's life, therefore, is to be understood as the unfolding of his powers according to the laws of his nature. Man, however, does not exist in general. While sharing the core of qualities with all members of his species, he is always an individual, a unique entity, different from everybody else. He differs by the particular blending of character, temperament, talents, dispositions, just as he differs in his fingertips. He can affirm his human potentialities only by realizing his individuality. The duty to be alive is the same as the duty to become oneself, to become the individual one potentially is. To sum up, good in humanistic ethics is the affirmation of life, the unfolding of man's powers. Virtue is responsibility towards one's own existence. Evil constitutes the crippling of man's powers. Vice is irresponsibility towards himself." There's a certain power, a certain simple power in that type of language, which again, as a kid, I mean, had a sort of a gripping effect on my imagination. But rather than this being an individual go-it-alone process, Fromm affirms that human nature is inherently social. For as he notes, quote, it is one of the characteristics of human nature that man finds his fulfillment and happiness only in relatedness to and in solidarity with fellow men. I mean, he always uses the male, pronoun because it was prior to the feminist era, but he means, of course, women as well. In short, Fromm's project and his ethics are humanistic to the core, and the project of living is something that takes place over a lifetime. And for Fromm, it is in art. As he beautifully states, quote, and I just love this analogy, and it's really stuck with me for the rest of my life. He says, not only medicine, engineering, and painting are arts, living itself is an art. In fact, the most important and at the same time the most difficult and complex art to be practiced by man. Its practice is not this or that specialized performance, but the performance of living, the process of developing into that which one is potentially. In the art of living, man is both the artist and the object of his art. I love that. I love that. Man, at the same time, we are both the artist and the object of our own creation, our own artistic, in the art of living. He is the sculptor and the marble, the physician and the patient. End quote. You could see how somebody would be sort of enchanted by that sort of imagery, especially if you felt needy and you wanted to make something of yourself and get beyond your condition. That image, that we have it within us to fashion our lives, and as we fashion our lives, we are both the artist and the object of our art, has always resonated with me very powerfully. And as mentioned, it's still a refrain that I return to often after more than 50 years. The person who so develops her or his own life, Fromm refers to as the productive character. The productive character, and the aim of developing a productive character is, he declares, again, the purpose and end of life. Speaking personally again, for a kid beaten down by life, these ideas that spoke to my role in developing life and doing so in a social context, which also laid out the purpose of life, namely to live it to the fullest, were truly inspiring, or as we might just say today, they were empowering ideas. Okay. Freud had once said that success in life is manifested most of all in both love and work. Love and work are the mainstays of our lives, okay? And I want to speak briefly about work, which brings me to this very place. In fact, this very lecture, okay? I want to speak about that, okay, notion of work. In his philosophy of work, Fromm borrowed most of all from Karl Marx's early thought. Fromm was greatly taken by Marx's earliest writings, which were entitled The Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. In those brief essays, Marx lays out his theory of alienation. Work is central, Marxism would declare. Work is central to our existence. Without work, we do not survive. And so what we do and the conditions under which we work are central to what we become. According to Marx, under capitalism, the worker is subject to a fourfold type of alienation. He or she is alienated from the means of production in that the means of production are owned and managed by the owners and the ruling class. The worker is also alienated from the products of his or her own labor. He does not, after all, own what he produces. Thirdly, he or she is alienated from his or her fellow worker, and ultimately, the worker is alienated from herself in that by being chained to an assembly line or to a desk toiling for endless hours, the worker is not exercising his or her own interests, their intrinsic gifts or potentials. Work under capitalism, in other words, is to a great extent alienated drudgery. Okay, that's what it is. You're alienated from yourself, right? And how many people really do feel fulfilled in their work, feeling that they're using their best talents and developing themselves in the work that they do? I think not a majority. For Marx and for Freud, work is central to what we become. In simplest terms, when we work, we are extending our powers to mold the world outside of ourselves. That's what work is. It's a molding of the world beyond ourselves. And when we do so, to exercise our powers to transform the world outside of ourselves, we reciprocally or dialectically transform ourselves. In other words, and in briefest terms, the primary purpose of work is not to accumulate wealth or to become rich or even to make a living. The primary purpose of work is to, again, express ourselves. It's to unfold our latent potentialities, and in the service of doing that, molding the external world, we reciprocally mold our own characters. And this insight became the source of greatest personal consequence for me. Here I am, not exaggerating in the slightest. When I entered that stage of life, when I went into the workforce, I never gave a second thought about making money. I literally did not think that the purpose of work was to make money. Okay? In fact, I set the stage for that value orientation by majoring in college in classical Greek and Latin, right? Which one seldom does, I think, thinking that you're going to really score big, right, on the market or become very wealthy, okay? Now, I have to be very clear. As I've gotten older, it's become clear to me, and for a lot of people who are of my vintage in the audience, that I lived economically in a very privileged time. I, in effect, grew up in the 50s, right? But post-war era, when the economy was booming, the union movement was very strong, the middle class was growing, the economy was at my back, and I literally did not have to think. My presumption was, naive as I was, but when my naivete really turned out to be correct, is that I didn't have to worry about making it. The economy was going to take care of me. And that, indeed, that sense of privilege really drives my commitment now in this moment to say we've got to restore that economy. I mean, I'm tired of hearing how well the economy is doing. I mean, if you play in the market, I guess it's doing very well for you. But if you've got a crappy job at minimum wage, right, with no security, working for a subcontractor or subcontractor, making minimum wage with no security, no benefits, no dignity, no respect, no nothing, the economy can't be very good. And $400, okay, in discretionary income in your saving account. That's not a strong economy. And it's because I basically was the object, okay, of a privileged economy that allowed me to major in classical Greek and Latin, and so I'm not have to worry about an income. I'm really committed to wanting to restore that type of economy now. That's what we have to do. We have to, and by the way, the unions, with all their corruption and all their problems, I got to tell you, the unions built the middle class in this country. And I don't want to get too political, but it's Ronald Reagan who really helped destroy, do you know what I'm saying, the union movement. And we've got to rebuild that if we want to have a strong economy for my kids will be okay, but my grandchildren and so on and so forth. We've really got to work hard to try to, you know what I'm saying, and we can look back at the 1950s and see what we had in terms of the structures that basically grounded the economy. So anyway, that's a whole other discussion. In fact, I should say that I chose a career in ethical culture leadership. And here I'm being very sincere. This was a deliberate choice. I chose a career in ethical culture leadership because I believe then, and I believe now, that it came closest to in the real world, to fulfilling the Frommian ideal of enabling me, as best as I could imagine, to live out my values, ideals, and interests in the service of building my character. In other words, becoming the kind of person that I wanted to be. Two things have resulted from following out or living out Fromm's neo-Marxist philosophy of work. The first is that I have been, and I can say this and I thank you all, that I have been amazingly fulfilled in my work. A statement that I think tragically few people can make. Okay. Here is a vocation where I can follow my own interests, engage myself deeply with other people and a lovely community, develop my intellectual, social, and moral potentials, okay, and fulfill my vocational pursuits, keeping my integrity intact. I don't think many people in the work world can say that. I can say that. Erich Fromm has led me to a very privileged work life, and I don't regret it for a moment. The second result, however, of following Fromm's ideal is that I'm not rich. Okay, that's also true. But as Fromm would be quick to say, that's not the point of work, and it's not the point of life either. Life is an experience. It's not the accumulation of chits. Okay, it's an experience. And if I can have those experiences, believe me, I want for very few experiences in life, despite the fact that, we raised 6 children, we had very modest incomes. I don't really, I've traveled the world, I've been able to explore ideas, I've had friends, I have a community, I have a great work life. I really am not complaining here. I mean, it's been very, very good. So far, okay, I've been discussing Fromm's personal psychology and his philosophy of work. I want to conclude, and I'll bring this to an end, with a brief review of his social philosophy, which I think remains actually relevant in this moment, okay? In 1941, during the war, Fromm wrote the book Escape from Freedom, which attempted in part to explain in psychological terms the emergence of fascism. For Fromm, fascism and Nazism did not arise simply on the power of authoritarian leaders and a hateful ideology, but because of the social characters of the masses of people who were ready to embrace it. Okay, I mean, Fromm was born in Germany, he was a German Jew, and he understood the German social character, and he applies that understanding to his understanding of the emergence of fascism. As individuals, we all grow in our freedom and independence from our parents, and though we cherish freedom, the downside of freedom can lead us to being alone and isolated. For Fromm, the condition of isolation generates anxiety, and anxiety is simply intolerable for human beings. As a result, people have a propensity to seek what he calls mechanisms of escape from freedom. We all want to be free, but on the other hand, freedom can be a very anxiety-provoking circumstance. That's his psychological insight. The first approach reflects Fromm's idea. He notes, quote, "By one course, the person can progress to positive freedom. He can relate himself spontaneously to the world of love and work in the genuine expression of his emotional, sensuous, and intellectual capabilities. He can thus become one again with man, nature, and himself without giving up the independence and integrity of his individual life. The other course open to him is to fall back, to give up his freedom, and try to overcome his aloneness by eliminating that gap that has arisen between himself and the world. This course of escape is characterized by its compulsive character, like every escape from a threatening panic. It is also characterized by the more or less complete surrender of the individuality and the integrity of the self." End quote. This mechanism of escape leads to what Fromm calls, quote, "the authoritarian personality that can take the form of the sadistic person who seeks to make others dependent on himself or herself, to exploit others, or to cause pain to others by humiliating or embarrassing them. The sadistic personality can rationalize his control over others by claiming that, quote, "I am so wonderful and unique that I have the right to expect that others will become dependent on me." That has a contemporary sound to it. Right? It's got a little bit unnerved. The flip side of the sadistic personality structure is the masochist. That is, people who feel themselves insignificant and show a marked dependence on powers outside of themselves, on other people, institutions, and nature. It was Fromm's view that social and economic and historical conditions in Germany before the war generated large swaths of the German population with this authoritarian character orientation. Thus, they were primed to be led and manipulated by a demagogic and dictatorial leader. In the 1950s, and looking to American society, Fromm was to use parallel ideas to try to explain how corporate capitalism reduces the worker to what he called an automaton conformity, in which one's individuality is submerged and one becomes a cog in the machine, so to speak. It was the America of Willy Loman, right, Death of the Salesman, of Willy Loman, of a person who may be materially well off, but spiritually impoverished. It was a society in which materialism, consumerism, conformity, and passivity robbed people of being in touch with their own unique identities, of people's dependence on themselves as the active centers of their powers and experiences, rather than to find it by conforming with others. By contrast, Fromm was arguing that a sane society consisted of citizens who were self-directed. As such, they depended on their own capacities to love and to create, to think, and to reason, and to feel connected to themselves and to others. In the 1950s, Fromm was not the only one to think or write this way. He borrowed from the sociologists David Reisman and Richard Hofstadter, and the anthropologist Margaret Mead, and many others who were writing about the loss of productive individualism and the atrophy of democracy in the face of materialism and conformity brought on by mass society and corporate capitalism. In our time, such thinkers and their critique of America, I think, deserve another look. I think some of those thinkers of the 1950s speak in a voice that's relevant to the current moment. They may have written 70 years ago, but much of their thinking, I think, can be applied to our current situation and our concern about the need to revitalize our democracy in the face of the juggernaut of corporate power and the blandishments of materialism that diminish sensitivity to more humanistic and abiding moral values. Erich Fromm's answer on the political level made him a type of social prophet. His response to the crushing power of the corporate state that generates mindless consumerism, materialism, and conformity was the emergence of a democratic socialist humanism that would enable, that was his political ideal, that would enable human flourishing both as individuals and in solidarity with others. And speaking again in personal terms, I've got to say that Fromm's humanistic vision of society, since I encountered him in the 1960s, a period again of at least fervent political idealism, has indeed personally framed my own political and social vision, however utopian it may be and however it may ultimately elude our grasp. At its base, again, a society is a society that recognizes and allows for and promotes human flourishing as its highest purpose and aim. That is a humanistic, truly a humanistic society that puts human beings up front and not profits and money and consumerism and so on and so forth. That was sort of the Frommian ideal, and it's mine. In closing, let me say that we change as we grow. Since I read Erich Fromm and was inspired by him as a teenager, I have encountered many other thinkers and lived through my own life experiences. As a result, there is much of his thinking that I've moved beyond. One fault is that in his presentation, he always, and with great enchanting power, speaks of the human being in ideal terms. In other words, he has little positive regard to the human being in his fallen state, so to speak. We are all imperfect and always will be, and yet there is little in his thinking, unfortunately, that allows for that, and in that sense there's a type of moralism in his philosophy in that he sets goals for both individuals and society which can never truly be met. I mean, I was always inspired by him, but always feeling, again, on the other side, a little bit bad about myself because I could never live up to the type of ideal that he was promoting. And I think putting forward philosophies of perfection and idealism always carry that danger with it that they become somewhat moralistic and so on, because you cannot, by definition, meet those ideals. You always fall short. One can never live up to his standards of a fully actualized, fully developed person. There is beauty in the human condition, I think, even though we are less than perfect, and there is a need for self-acceptance in our imperfections. Yet Fromm's philosophy, again, leaves little room for that. There are other issues, such as a positive discussion in his thought of our social obligations and duties to others, which has become more of a mainstay of my own personal mature thinking. And I could mention other points of departure which I've embraced. Well, that is now. But back then, when I was young and impressionable, and very much in need, I was inspired. And Erich Fromm, more than anyone else, made me a humanist and set me on my life's course. And as I look back, I conclude that I could have done a lot worse.